I need to report an aggressive individual with military training who is threatening residents of our community.
That's the police report the HOA president filed against me at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. There was just one problem. At 4:15 that Wednesday, I was standing in the produce aisle at Walmart with my 12-year-old son, arguing about orange juice. Security cameras confirmed it. My receipt confirmed it. She fabricated a police report against a combat veteran, a man who had just come home from 15 months in Kuwait to find her husband had built 15 mansions on his family's land. She didn't know about the cameras. She didn't know about the receipt. And she didn't know that filing a false report in Georgia is a criminal offense. But here's the real kicker. Her husband had committed an even bigger crime. Building on a deployed soldier's property without consent violates the Service Members Civil Relief Act, federal law. So her little police report just became one more piece of evidence in a case that was about to end both of them. What would you do? But let me take you back to where this started. My grandfather, Harlan Townsend, bought 240 acres in Lumpkin County, Georgia, in the summer of 1948. He'd just come home from the Pacific, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the kind of places that make a man appreciate flat land and quiet mornings. He paid $1,100 cash for the whole parcel. Built the farmhouse himself, board by board, with a creek running behind it and the Blue Ridge foothills rising to the north. That house is where my father grew up, where I grew up, where my son Cole took his first steps on the pine plank floor that still creaks in the same spots it always did. I met Laura at a church picnic when I was 23. She had this way of laughing that made you forget whatever stupid thing you'd just said. We got married under the oak tree by the creek, the one with the trunk so wide 3 men couldn't link arms around it. She loved that land almost as much as I did. She'd sit on the stone bench I built her by the water, reading paperbacks until the fireflies came out. She was diagnosed with lung cancer 2 years before my deployment. Never smoked a day in her life. The doctors said sometimes the body just turns on itself. She fought for 14 months. Lost on a Tuesday morning in March, with Cole holding one hand and me holding the other. She was 34. After Laura died, the land was all I had left that still felt like her. The bench, the creek, the oak tree where we said our vows. I'd walk the property line at dusk just to hear the frogs she used to count from the porch. Grief doesn't go away, it just gets quieter. Then my unit got orders. Kuwait, 15 months. I couldn't take Cole, so my sister Jolene, she lives in Dahlonega, about 40 minutes south, took him in. I signed a power of attorney for emergencies, kissed my son goodbye, and drove to Fort Stewart with the windows down. The last thing I smelled was wet Georgia clay and apple blossoms from the orchard my grandfather planted in 1961. I came home in November, drove 15 hours through rain, through the dark, through 3 states. When I hit Lumpkin County, the road felt different, smoother. I turned onto Townsend Road, and my tires hit asphalt where gravel used to be. Then I saw the gate. Wrought iron, 12 feet tall. A brass sign bolted to stone pillars, Eagle Ridge Estates, a premier gated community. Behind it, 15 mansions lined up on fresh graded lots with sod lawns, 3-car garages, and decorative lampposts that hadn't existed 15 months ago. They sat right in the middle of my grandfather's east pasture, where the apple trees used to be. I pulled up to the gate, and a woman stepped out of a white Cadillac Escalade parked sideways across the entrance. Blonde hair pinned tight, linen blazer over yoga pants, Versace sunglasses pushed up on her forehead, clipboard pressed against her chest like a badge. She walked toward my truck with the kind of smile that says, "I own the oxygen here." "Sir, this is a private community. Do you have a visitor pass, or are you with a delivery service?" I was wearing my ACUs, dusty boots, a duffel bag in the back seat. I looked at the mansions behind her, then back at her clipboard, then at the land my grandfather cleared with a mule and a machete 75 years ago. "Ma'am," I said, "I own this land." She tilted her head the way people do when they're about to say something condescending. "I don't think so, sweetheart. This is Eagle Ridge Estates, and I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." Her name was Brenda Whitfield. She had been running Eagle Ridge for exactly 8 months, since the day the first family moved in, and she had absolutely no idea what she'd just stepped into. The next morning I walked the property, not the part with the mansions, my land. The farmhouse, the barn, the creek, the old fence line. It was all still there, just surrounded. My grandfather's house sat in the middle of Eagle Ridge Estates, like a rotten tooth in a row of veneers. The creek still ran, but someone had rerouted the drainage so the runoff from the subdivision poured into it. The water that used to run clear now carried a gray film of construction silt. I stood on the back porch drinking coffee and watched the landscaping crew manicure a lawn 30 yards from my barn. The man on the riding mower waved at me like I was a curiosity, the guy living in the old house that didn't match. Brenda didn't wait long. By 9 o'clock the next day, I had 4 violation notices taped to my front door. 4, on my own property, from an HOA I had never joined. Violation 1. My truck was not consistent with the aesthetic standards of the community. It was a 2014 Ford F250 with a dent in the tailgate. I'd driven it to Kuwait and back. Violation 2. The farm equipment in my barn, my grandfather's tractor, his plow, his post hole digger, was classified as junk and debris subject to immediate removal. Equipment that had worked this land for decades was now trash because it didn't match someone's idea of a subdivision. Violation 3. My wooden fence, hand-split cedar that Harlan Townsend put up in 1953, was an unapproved structure not consistent with community fencing guidelines. And Violation 4. My dog, a 10-year-old blue-tick coonhound named Hatchet, was in violation of the community leash policy. Hatchet had been walking that land off-leash since he was a puppy. The land was mine. The dog was mine. The only thing that wasn't mine was the audacity of the woman who wrote those violations. I didn't respond. I photographed each notice, dated them, and filed them in a folder I labeled Brenda. 2 days later, she came back. This time she knocked. Cole answered the door. He was 12, still adjusting to being home after a year with his aunt, still figuring out why the neighborhood looked nothing like the one he'd left. "Is your father home?" Brenda asked, peering past Cole into the house like she was evaluating the furniture. I came to the door. She held out a clipboard with a multi-page document. "Mr. Townsend, every property within Eagle Ridge Estates boundaries is subject to HOA governance. You'll need to sign the membership agreement and submit your first annual assessment, $4,200. I looked at the document, then at her. "Ma'am, I'm not in your HOA. I was here before your HOA existed. The covenant was recorded with the county. Your property falls within the platted boundaries. It's not optional." That night I pulled the covenant off the county website. She was right about one thing. Gerald Whitfield had drawn the community boundary to include my property. On paper, my farmhouse was inside Eagle Ridge Estates. The HOA technically claimed jurisdiction over a house that predated the HOA by 72 years. But here's what Brenda didn't understand, and what Gerald was counting on nobody noticing. You can draw a line around someone's property on a map. That doesn't make it yours. It doesn't transfer ownership. It doesn't create authority. All it does is create the illusion of authority, which is the only currency Brenda Whitfield ever dealt in. The covenant included my property because Gerald needed the acreage count to meet the county's minimum lot density requirement for his zoning variance. He didn't include my land because he bought it. He included it because he needed the math to work, and he figured the owner was deployed overseas and would never check. He figured wrong. I closed the laptop and looked at the stack of violation notices on the kitchen table. Brenda had fined me for a fence my grandfather built before she was born. She'd classified his equipment as junk. She tried to leash my dog on my own land. And she wanted $4,200 a year for the privilege of living in a house my family had owned since Harry Truman was president. The smell of fresh paint drifted through the screen door. That chemical, wet latex smell from the mansion next door, coating over the apple blossom scent that had filled this porch every spring of my life. I folded the notices, put them back in the folder, and wrote one word on the tab: evidence. Gerald Whitfield showed up on a Thursday. Black Mercedes, navy suit. The kind of tan you get from a golf course, not a job site. He had a lawyer with him, a tall, thin man in a gray suit who stood slightly behind Gerald like a page shadow. They pulled into my driveway without asking. Gerald got out smiling, the kind of smile that comes with a handshake you didn't ask for and a deal you didn't want. Garrett, right? Gerald Whitfield. I developed Eagle Ridge. He said it the way you'd introduce yourself at a cocktail party, like building 15 mansions on someone else's land was a conversation starter. I leaned against the porch railing and waited. Listen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your property boundaries. My surveyor, Wayne Prescott, I said. Gerald blinked. Right. Wayne conducted the survey before we broke ground. The plat was filed with the county and approved. Your property ends at the old fence line near the creek. My property ends where my grandfather's deed says it ends, not where your surveyor drew a line. The lawyer stepped forward and handed me an envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter on heavy cream paper. It said, in language designed to sound more impressive than it was, that my structure and associated improvements were encroaching on Eagle Ridge Estates, and that I had 30 days to vacate or face legal proceedings. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my back pocket. The man who built 15 houses on my land had just sent me a letter saying I was trespassing on his development. That's like a burglar filing a noise complaint because the homeowner's alarm woke him up. Gerald waited for a reaction. He didn't get one. Think about it, Garrett. We can make this easy. Nobody wants a prolonged legal situation. I appreciate you stopping by, I said. You have a good day. He left. The lawyer left. The Mercedes left a cloud of red dust that settled on my truck like a reminder. That night I called Jolene. Joe, when the construction started, did anyone come talk to you about the land? She went quiet for a second. Gerald's office sent a letter. Said they were developing the adjacent parcel and it wouldn't affect our property. I didn't have legal authority to do anything. I wasn't on the deed. I called the county and they said the permits were all approved. Did anyone ever ask to survey our land? No, never. I hung up and sat on the porch for a long time. Gerald hadn't surveyed my land. He'd surveyed around it, moved the line on paper, and built before anyone could stop him. He didn't make a mistake. He made a plan. The next morning I drove to Dahlonega and hired Emmett Hale. Emmett was 71 years old, had been a licensed surveyor for 30 years, and had no connection to the county planning office, Gerald Whitfield, or anyone named Prescott. He wore overalls, carried a transit that looked older than my truck, and spoke in sentences so short they should have come with periods between every word. We walked the boundary together. I showed him my grandfather's original markers, concrete posts poured in 1948, each one stamped with HT and a property corner number. Most were buried under leaf litter and vine growth, but they were still there. Every single one. Emmett measured, flagged, and recorded. It took him 2 days. When he was done, he spread the plat on the tailgate of my truck and pointed to the eastern boundary. Son, whoever drew the survey for this subdivision moved your line 412 feet to the west. See this? He tapped the paper. 15 of those homes are sitting on your deeded acreage. I looked across the tree line at the rooftops. Slate gray, terracotta, cedar shake. 15 families eating dinner, watching television, putting their kids to bed in houses built on land that belonged to my grandfather before most of them were born. How much land are we talking about? Emmett folded the plat. 38 acres, give or take a fence post. 38 acres. 15 mansions. And not one of them had a legal right to be there. I drove home with the survey on the passenger seat and the windows down. The wind smelled like pine and wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge. For the first time since I got home, the anger started to feel less like heat and more like fuel. Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting the following week. I know because she taped the notice to my door, right next to the latest batch of violation fines that now totaled $11,000 for offenses including failure to maintain approved landscaping on land that had never had landscaping in its entire existence. The meeting was held in the Eagle Ridge Community Clubhouse, a building that sat on my family's land, paid for by HOA dues collected from homeowners who didn't know they were living on stolen property. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. I wasn't invited. But Cole needed to get to school, so I was busy anyway. Brenda's agenda had one item: addressing the non-conforming property at 1847 Townsend Road. That was my house, my grandfather's house. And the word non-conforming was doing a lot of heavy lifting, considering the house had been there 7 decades before anyone conformed to anything. The board voted 11-4 to install a 6-foot privacy wall around my property. Not a fence, a wall. Brenda called it a visual buffer to protect community aesthetics and property values. What it really was a cage, and she had contractors out there by dawn the next morning. I woke up to the sound of a bobcat excavator chewing through the ground 30 feet from my front porch. Cole sat up in bed and said, "Dad, what's happening?" The vibration rattled through the pine plank floor, shaking dust out of joints my grandfather cut by hand. Outside, 2 men in hard hats were digging footer trenches while Brenda stood in the driveway, clipboard pressed to her chest, directing traffic like she was building the Hoover Dam. By noon, they'd poured concrete footers on 3 sides of my property. By the next morning, the wall was going up. Cinder block, 6 feet high. And it blocked the only road that connected my property to the county highway. Cole couldn't get to school. I had to drive 40 minutes on a logging road through the back of the property, then loop around on a state highway just to reach town. An ambulance couldn't reach the house. A fire truck couldn't reach the house. Brenda Whitfield had effectively sealed a 12-year-old boy and a combat veteran inside their own land. I called Sheriff Tate Dunning. He came out, looked at the wall, scratched the back of his neck, and said the 5 words every person in a property dispute loves to hear. "It's a civil matter, Mr. Townsend." A woman had blocked emergency access to a child's home, and the sheriff called it a civil matter. I suppose if the house caught fire and Cole couldn't get out, that would finally qualify as criminal. Maybe. I didn't argue with Dunning. I didn't yell at Brenda. I didn't touch the wall. I pulled out my phone, took 47 photographs from every angle, recorded 3 minutes of video including Brenda giving instructions to the crew, and saved it all to a cloud folder. Then I started driving the 40-minute detour. Every morning. Every afternoon. Cole did his homework in the truck. We ate fast food on the way home, because by the time we got there it was too late to cook. The smell of cold French fries and truck exhaust became our new evening routine. One night, Cole was sitting at the kitchen table doing math homework. He put his pencil down and looked at me. "Dad, why does that lady hate us?" I wanted to give him a real answer. Something about power and insecurity, and the kind of people who confuse authority with decency. Instead, I said, "She doesn't hate us, buddy. She just loves power more than she loves people." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. 12-year-olds see more than we give them credit for. That week, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Brenda on her terms. Fines, meetings, walls, violation notices. I was going to fight on mine. I was going to find out exactly how Gerald Whitfield built 15 houses on my land, exactly who helped him do it, and exactly how much it was going to cost both of them when the truth came out. I drove to the county records office on a Monday morning, and what I found in those files changed everything. The Lumpkin County Records Office smelled like old carpet and toner ink. The woman at the counter, her name tag said Darlene, pulled the original building permits for Eagle Ridge Estates without asking why. Small town government. They don't need a reason. They just need a request. I spread the permits across a table in the back room and started reading. Every permit referenced the same boundary survey, survey number LC-2024-0847, prepared and certified by Wayne Prescott, licensed land surveyor, state of Georgia. Then I pulled my grandfather's deed. Recorded in 1948, filed with Lumpkin County. Clear, unambiguous property description with metes and bounds that matched Emmett Hale's independent survey down to the foot. I laid them side by side. Gerald's survey had moved my eastern boundary 412 feet west. On paper, it shrank my property by 38 acres and added them to the Eagle Ridge Plat. That line didn't slip. It didn't drift. Someone picked it up and moved it. Deliberately. I asked Arlene to pull every survey Wayne Prescott had filed in the past 5 years. She came back with a stack, 7 projects, all developed by Whitfield Development Group. In every single one, the boundary lines had shifted in Gerald's favor. 7 surveys, 7 developments, 7 times the neighbors lost acreage they didn't know they'd lost. Wayne Prescott wasn't making mistakes. He was running a service. Then I noticed something else. Gerald hadn't purchased title insurance for Eagle Ridge. Every real estate development in the country buys title insurance. It protects the developer and the buyers if the ownership turns out to be disputed. Gerald skipped it. The only reason to skip title insurance is if you already know what a title search would find. He knew the land was mine. He knew the deed existed. And he built anyway, betting I'd never come home to check. That evening, I called the Army JAG office at Fort Stewart. I explained the situation. Deployed service member, property boundary altered, construction on my land during deployment, no notification, no consent. The officer on the other end went quiet for a moment, then said something that made my spine straighten. "Sergeant Townsend, what you're describing is a potential violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. That's federal law. It prohibits any material action against the property of a deployed service member without court approval. If someone built on your land while you were overseas without obtaining a court order, they're not just looking at a civil judgment. They're looking at federal charges. Federal charges. Not county, not state, federal." Gerald Whitfield hadn't just stolen 38 acres from a family. He'd stolen them from a deployed soldier. And Congress had written a very specific law about that exact situation, because it had happened before to other service members, and the government decided it should never happen again. The SCRA doesn't play favorites. It doesn't negotiate, and it carries penalties up to $100,000 in a year in federal prison per violation. Gerald had 15 houses on my land, 15 separate violations. I sat in my truck in the county parking lot, folder on the passenger seat, windows down. The evening light was turning the Blue Ridge foothills gold and purple. Somewhere behind those hills, 15 families were sitting down to dinner in houses built on a lie. And somewhere in a Mercedes, Gerald Whitfield was probably pouring himself a drink, confident that the deployed soldier whose land he'd stolen would never figure out what happened. I looked at the folder, then at the hills, and for the first time since I'd come home, I smiled. I found Clay Sumner through Pastor Dennis Calloway, who'd known my family since before I was born. Clay was a real estate attorney in Dahlonega, small office, 2 paralegals, and a Navy anchor tattooed on his forearm that he never talked about unless you asked. He was the kind of lawyer who still answered his own phone and kept a Bible on the same shelf as his Georgia code annotated. I sat in his office with the folder, deed, surveys, permits, Prescott's records, SCRA guidance from JAG, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is how you know a lawyer is either very good or very expensive. Clay was both. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, and said, "Gerald Whitfield built 15 houses on your land while you were serving overseas?" He paused. "This isn't a lawsuit, Garrett. This is a layup." We built the strategy over the next 2 weeks. 3 prongs, each one designed to hit Gerald from a direction he wasn't watching. The first was a quiet title action, a lawsuit filed in Lumpkin County Superior Court, asking the judge to formally declare that I was the legal owner of the 38 acres. The key evidence was the 1948 deed, the independent survey, and the discrepancy with Prescott's plat. Under Georgia law, a quiet title action requires notification to all interested parties. That meant every homeowner in Eagle Ridge would receive a legal notice telling them the land under their house was in dispute. Gerald couldn't hide it anymore. The second was the SCRA complaint. Clay filed it directly with the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, any material action taken against a deployed service member's property without a court order is a federal violation. Gerald hadn't just failed to get a court order. He'd actively concealed the action by exploiting my absence. The DOJ doesn't handle these casually. Once they open a file, it doesn't close until someone answers for it. The third wasn't legal at all. It was personal. Clay and I, along with Pastor Calloway, who commanded more trust in Lumpkin County than any attorney or sheriff, went door to door at Eagle Ridge. 15 homes, 15 conversations. We didn't threaten, we didn't posture. We told the truth. Your home is built on land that belongs to my family. The developer knew it. He falsified a survey to cover it. I'm not trying to take your home. but you deserve to know what happened." Reactions varied. Some went pale. One woman cried. A retired engineer named Thornton Wells pulled up the county GIS map on his tablet, overlaid the deed description, and said, "Son of a bitch, he's right." Two couples called Gerald immediately. Gerald didn't answer. Three of them called their own lawyers. One man, a younger guy with a new baby, just stared at me and said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to prove I own the land. Then we're going to figure out a way for everyone to stay." That answer changed the temperature of every conversation that followed. I wasn't the enemy. Gerald was. Back at the farmhouse, I set up a war room at the kitchen table. Timeline on a legal pad. Every date Gerald acted. Every date Brenda harassed me. Every violation notice. Every photograph of the wall. Every receipt from the 40-minute detour. Every dollar of fake fines. I installed 4 security cameras. 2 on the house, 1 on the barn, 1 on the fence post facing the road. Hardwired, cloud-backed, motion-activated. If Brenda so much as adjusted her sunglasses on my property, I'd have it in high definition. Cole helped me run the cable. He was 12, and he was angry in the way kids get angry when they can't fix what's wrong, but refuse to stop trying. He held the ladder. He handed me zip ties. He didn't complain once. At 2 in the morning, after Cole had fallen asleep on the sofa with one foot hanging off the cushion, I sat at the table under the yellow glow of the desk lamp. Papers everywhere. The deed, the surveys, the violation notices, Clay's filing drafts. Outside, crickets sang through the screen door like they'd been singing since 1948, which they probably had. I wrote a timeline on a fresh sheet of paper. Every day Gerald violated my property. Every day Brenda piled on. Every day the county looked the other way. Then I closed the folder and went to bed. Not because I was tired, because I was ready. Gerald got the quiet title notification on a Tuesday. By Thursday, his lawyer had quit. I know because Clay got a courtesy call from the attorney, a man named Philip Cranston from a mid-size firm in Gainesville. I reviewed the file, Cranston told Clay. "I'm not touching an SCRA case. My firm has a policy against representing clients in potential federal criminal matters. I've advised Mr. Whitfield to seek alternative counsel." Translation: Gerald's own lawyer looked at the evidence and decided his client was guilty enough to run from. That's not a legal opinion. That's a survival instinct. Without a lawyer, Gerald did what desperate men do. He came to me directly. He pulled into the driveway on a Saturday morning. No Mercedes this time. A rented SUV, like he was trying to look ordinary. He walked up to the porch where I was replacing a rotted board on the steps. Cole was inside eating cereal. "Garrett, listen, let's work this out." He spread his hands. "Soldier to citizen. I'll buy the 38 acres from you, right now. Name your price." I kept sanding the board. Didn't look up. "You want to buy land you already built on without my permission?" I blew sawdust off the plank. "That's like a carjacker offering to pay for gas." Gerald's smile flickered. "I'm trying to be reasonable here." "So am I. That's why I haven't filed criminal charges yet." The smile disappeared. He stepped closer, lowered his voice like he was negotiating a hostage situation. "I'll tie this up in court for 10 years, Townsend. You'll go broke paying lawyers before you see a dime. You're a sergeant living in a 70-year-old farmhouse. I've got resources you can't imagine." I stood up, set the sandpaper on the railing. "Gerald, I'm going to give you some free advice. Go home. Call a good criminal defense attorney, and stop showing up at my house without one." He left. And the next thing he did was the dumbest move of his life. 3 days later, Clay got a call from Darlene at the county records office. Gerald had walked in and tried to file a backdated deed of sale, a document claiming he had purchased the 38 acres from me 2 years earlier, before my deployment. The purchase price listed was $350,000. My signature was on the bottom. Except I had never signed that document. I had never met with Gerald before my deployment, and I had never sold a single acre of my grandfather's land to anyone, ever. Darlene had processed enough filings to know when something smelled wrong. She compared the signature on the deed with my signature on file, the power of attorney I'd signed for Jolene. They didn't match, not even close. She flagged it and called Clay, who called me, who who called the JAG office. Gerald Whitfield had just committed forgery of a public record. In the state of Georgia, that's a felony, 1 to 10 years. And he'd done it in a county records office with security cameras, witnessed by a clerk who'd been doing this job for 19 years. Meanwhile, Brenda launched her own offensive. She called an emergency board meeting and presented a PowerPoint, and I wish I were making this up, titled Community Threat Assessment, 1847 Townsend Road. It featured clip art of soldiers, bullet points in Comic Sans, and a recommendation that the HOA hire private security to monitor the non-conforming property for signs of aggression. She was presenting a military veteran and his 12-year-old son as a security threat in a neighborhood built on the veteran's own land, using a PowerPoint with Comic Sans. The self-awareness deficit was almost artistic, but cracks were forming. 3 homeowners who had talked to me and Clay walked out of the meeting. Thornton Wells, the retired engineer, stood up and said, "Brenda, I've seen the deed. I've seen the survey. You're wasting our time." Then he left. Brenda's face turned the color of her blazer. She ended the meeting early. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the lights in the mansions flicker on, one by one. 15 houses, 15 families. Some of them were starting to understand that the woman who ran their HOA and the man who built their homes had sold them a lie. Literally and architecturally. The red Georgia clay under the new porch board still smelled like iron and rain, same as it did when my grandfather hammered the first nail into this house. Some things don't change, no matter how many mansions you stack on top of them. Brenda filed the police report on a Wednesday. I know the exact day because I was at Walmart buying groceries with Cole when it supposedly happened. According to her statement, I had approached her vehicle in an aggressive and threatening manner, made verbal threats of physical harm, and used intimidating body language consistent with military training. She claimed it happened at 4:15 in the afternoon on her driveway, in full view of neighbors. Sheriff Dunning showed up at my door the next morning. He looked uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that comes from knowing you're doing something stupid, but doing it anyway because someone filed paperwork. "Mr. Townsend, I've got a complaint here alleging, let me guess, Brenda Whitfield says I threatened her yesterday afternoon." He nodded. "What time does she say it happened?" 4:15. I opened my laptop, pulled up my security camera footage, and turned the screen toward him. At 4:15 the previous afternoon, the camera showed my driveway empty. My truck was gone. The timestamp was clear. Then I pulled out my phone and showed him the Walmart receipt. Time-stamped 4:07. Store cameras would confirm I was in the produce aisle at 4:15, arguing with Cole about whether we needed more orange juice. We did. He was right. Dunning stared at the receipt, then at the camera footage, then at me. "She lied," he said. Not a question. She lied. He folded the report, put it in his pocket, and for the first time since this whole thing started, looked at me like a person instead of a problem. "I'll document this. Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor in Georgia." "I know," I said. "Add it to the pile." Gerald, meanwhile, was getting creative in his desperation. Since the forged deed had blown up in his face, he tried a different angle. He hired a structural consultant, a man named Perry Buckner from Atlanta who, as far as I could tell, had exactly one qualification. He was willing to say whatever Gerald paid him to say. Buckner filed a report with the county, claiming my farmhouse was structurally compromised, presenting an imminent hazard to adjacent properties. He recommended immediate condemnation and demolition. The words were big, the science was small, and the signature at the bottom belonged to someone who had never set foot inside my house. Gerald's plan was elegant in its cruelty. If he couldn't take the land legally, he'd destroy the house that sat on it. No house, no emotional anchor. No emotional anchor, maybe the soldier gives up and sells. But Gerald didn't know 2 things. First, I had 20 years of military construction experience. I knew more about structural integrity than most engineers and every consultant Gerald could afford. Second, the county building inspector was a man named Walt Fielding, and Walt didn't like being told how to do his job by consultants from Atlanta. Walt drove out the next day. He walked through the house, checked the foundation, the framing, the roof joists, the floor supports. He tapped walls, looked at the crawl space, and spent 20 minutes in the attic. When he came down, he was almost smiling. "This house has better bones than half the new builds in the county," he said. "Whoever filed that complaint has never held a level. I'm marking it unfounded." Gerald's demolition play was dead before it started. That same week, I got a call from a woman named Nadine Pollock. She was a reporter for the Lumpkin County Gazette, the local weekly that covered everything from school board meetings to turkey season. Someone had tipped her off about the quiet title action and the HOA conflict. She wanted to meet. We sat on my front porch. I told her the story, all of it. The deployment, the land, the survey, the wall, the violation notices, Gerald's forged deed, Brenda's false police report, the SCRA. She recorded everything, took notes, photographed the wall, the violation notices, the original deed. When she was done, she closed her notebook and said, "This is going to be front page." "Not yet," I said. "Come to the county board meeting next Thursday. Bring a notebook." She tilted her head. "Why next Thursday?" "Because that's when the quiet title ruling comes down, and I want everyone in the room when it does." I stood on the porch that evening and watched the sunset paint the mansions gold and orange. 15 rooftops, 15 families, every single one of them sitting on my grandfather's land. And in 8 days, every single one of them would know it officially. The evening air smelled like honeysuckle and chimney smoke. Somewhere in one of those mansions, Gerald Whitfield was running out of moves. And somewhere in the driveway, Brenda's white Escalade was parked in its usual spot, right next to the clipboard that couldn't save her. The Lumpkin County Board of Supervisors meets in a room that smells like floor wax and burnt coffee. Folding chairs. A long table at the front with microphones that don't always work. An American flag in the corner with a crooked eagle topper. It's the kind of room where zoning variances get approved and nobody claps. That Thursday, every chair was full. The 15 Eagle Ridge homeowners sat in the middle rows, clustered together like passengers on a plane that just announced turbulence. Brenda sat in the front row, fresh blazer, fresh lipstick, clipboard on her lap like a security blanket. Gerald sat 2 seats behind her, gray-faced and sweating through a blue dress shirt. He had a new lawyer sitting next to him, a young guy from Atlanta who kept adjusting his tie and looking at the door like he was calculating the distance to the exit. I sat on the left side with Clay Sumner. Pastor Calloway sat behind us. Cole was with Jolene at home. I didn't want him seeing this. Sheriff Dunning stood against the back wall, arms crossed. Nadine Pollock sat in the second row with a camera and a reporter's notebook. The board chair called the hearing on the quiet title petition filed by Garrett Townsend regarding 38 acres in Section 12, Lumpkin County. Clay stood up. He was calm the way a man is calm when he knows his hand is unbeatable, and the only question is how long to let the other side sweat. He started with the deed. The original 1948 filing, meets and bounds, county recording number, chain of title from Harlan Townsend to my father, from my father to me, unbroken, undisputed. 77 years of ownership on paper, in ink, in the records of this very county. Then he put 2 documents on the projector, side by side. On the left, Wayne Prescott's survey for Eagle Ridge Estates. On the right, Emmett Hale's independent survey. The eastern boundary lines sat in 2 different places, 412 feet apart. The room went quiet. Not polite quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they've been living inside a lie. This line, Clay said, pointing to Prescott's survey, was moved, deliberately, to include 38 acres of Mr. Townsend's property inside the Eagle Ridge plat. This gave the developer the acreage he needed for his zoning variance and allowed him to build on land he did not own. Then he dropped the second bomb. Wayne Prescott's sworn affidavit, signed, notarized, and submitted to the district attorney. Prescott had flipped. He'd accepted $45,000 in cash from Gerald Whitfield to falsify the boundary survey. He had done the same thing for 6 other Whitfield developments across 3 counties. Names, dates, amounts, all in the affidavit. Gerald's new lawyer put his hand on Gerald's arm. Gerald didn't move. The third bomb. Clay presented the forged deed that Gerald had attempted to file at the county records office. The clerk's analysis showing the signature didn't match. The security camera footage showing Gerald personally submitting the document. Forgery of a public record, a felony in the state of Georgia. And finally, the SCRA. Clay read the relevant statute into the record. He explained that Sergeant First Class Garrett Townsend was deployed to Kuwait on active military orders when Gerald Whitfield broke ground on Eagle Ridge Estates. No court order was obtained. No notification was sent to the service member. No consent was given. Under federal law, every house built on that land during the deployment constituted a separate violation. 15 houses, 15 violations, up to $100,000 and 1 year in federal prison, each. Brenda stood up. Her voice cracked, but her volume didn't. This is ridiculous. That land was vacant. Nobody was using it. Clay didn't look at her. He spoke into the microphone, and his voice was flat as a closed book. The land wasn't vacant, Mrs. Whitfield. The owner was serving his country in Kuwait while your husband was stealing his property. The room didn't just get quiet. It held its breath. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then 3 more people. Then the whole room. The board chair gavelled for order. Then he read the ruling. The quiet title petition was granted. The 38 acres belonged to Garrett Townsend. The boundary survey filed by Wayne Prescott was declared fraudulent and struck from the county records. Sheriff Dunning pushed off the back wall and walked down the center aisle. He stopped at Gerald's row. Gerald Whitfield, you're under arrest for fraud, bribery of a public official, and forgery of public records. Please stand up. Gerald stood. His new lawyer didn't. The handcuffs clicked. 2 sharp sounds that echoed in the silent room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Brenda clutched her clipboard with both hands. You can't do this. I'll sue every one of you. She looked around the room for support. Not one person met her eyes. Not one. Nadine Pollock's camera shutter fired 6 times. Front page. The next 3 months moved faster than the previous 15. Gerald Whitfield was indicted on 14 counts: fraud, bribery, forgery, and multiple SCRA violations. His bail was set at $400,000. The DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a parallel federal investigation. Wayne Prescott, who had cooperated early, received a reduced sentence, 2 years probation and permanent revocation of his surveyor's license. His career was over, but he kept his freedom. Gerald would not be so lucky. Brenda was charged with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor, 6 months probation and community service. She resigned as HOA president the day after the hearing, though resigned is generous. She was told by the board's newly hired attorney that if she didn't step down voluntarily, they'd remove her at the next meeting by unanimous vote. She chose dignity. Or whatever version of dignity involves clearing out your clipboard collection and driving away in an Escalade while your husband sits in county lockup. The HOA elected Thornton Wells, the retired engineer who had walked out of Brenda's Comic Sans PowerPoint, as the new president. His first act was to void every violation notice ever issued to my property. His second was to formally apologize, on behalf of the board, for the wall. The wall came down on a Saturday. 4 men with sledgehammers. The cinder blocks broke apart in chunks that thudded into the red Georgia clay like headstones falling. Cole stood on the porch and watched. When the last section crumbled, he looked at me and said, "Can Hatchet go for a walk now?" "Yeah, buddy. Hatchet can go for a walk." The 15 homeowners had a problem. Their homes sat on land they didn't own, built by a developer who had committed fraud to put them there. They had legal options: sue Gerald for damages, demand rescission of their purchase contracts, or negotiate with me. Most of them were families, kids in school, jobs in the area, lives they'd started building in houses they thought were theirs. I didn't want to tear families apart. Gerald did that. My fight was never with them. Clay and I drafted ground lease agreements. 30-year terms, $1,800 per month per home. Well below market rate for the acreage, but fair enough that nobody had to choose between their house and their savings. 13 families signed within the first week. The other 2 signed after their attorneys confirmed what Clay had already told them. This was the best deal they'd get, and Garrett Townsend was the reason it wasn't worse. $27,000 a month, $324,000 a year, from land that Brenda Whitfield had tried to find me for living on. I used the first year's income to establish the Townsend Veterans Housing Fund, a nonprofit that helps veterans in Lumpkin County with down payments on their first homes. Pastor Calloway sits on the board. Clay handles the legal work pro bono. We funded 6 families in the first year. 6 veterans who came home to something better than what I came home to. The farmhouse stayed exactly the way it was. Pine plank floors, tin roof, the porch where my grandfather sat every evening and my wife read every afternoon. Brenda had called it an eyesore. The county assessor now lists it as a historic property. The non-conforming structure turned out to be the most valuable piece of real estate in Eagle Ridge Estates because it owned everything underneath the rest of them. The irony needed its own zip code. On a Sunday in April, Pastor Calloway organized a community gathering on the land. Eagle Ridge homeowners showed up, longtime county residents, veterans from the VFW post in Dahlonega. Cole played catch with the neighbors' kids on the east pasture, the same pasture where mansions now stood, where apple trees once grew, where my grandfather plowed behind a mule that was too stubborn to walk a straight line. I sat on Laura's bench by the creek. The water was running clear again. Thornton had fixed the drainage as his third act as HOA president. The frogs were back. The fireflies were coming out. I thought about what Laura would say if she could see all this. She'd probably laugh first. Then she'd say something like, "Only you could turn a land dispute into a charity, Garrett." Yeah, she would have loved this. If you've ever had an HOA try to tell you what to do on your own property, drop your story in the comments below. I know I'm not the only one. And if you want to see what happens when a developer tries the same trick on a retired Marine in Montana, hit that subscribe button. That story is coming next, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.
First, this one is different. Not the 15 Mansons part that extreme, but the feeling of coming home and finding someone took what was yours while you wasn't watching. That's real. What made Garrett win wasn't anger or money, it was patience. He came home to fake finance, a wall blocking his driveway, and a developer threatening to evict him from his own land. Most people would have exploded. He photographed everything. He hired the right people. He filed the right paperwork. And he let Daryl and Brenda keep making mistakes until the evidence buried them. Here's the takeaway. Documentation beats confrontation every single time. A photograph with a timestamp outweighs a shouting match. A recorded deed outweighs a clipboard. And a federal law protecting service members outweighs all the fake authority in the world. Garrett didn't just get his land back. He turned it into a fund that helps other veterans find their way home. That Kyle ending was telling. If you have been through an HOA overreach or a developer who thought the rules didn't apply to them, drop your story in the comments. And hit subscribe because next week, a developer in Montana tried this same trick on a retired Marine who's also a licensed structural engineer. You can guess how that ends.